Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CSIS, and thank you for being here. Thank you also for the people that are watching us online. My name is Romina Bandura. I'm a senior fellow here at the Project on Prosperity and Development, and I'm honored to be moderating this important panel today. Where we're going to be discussing anti-corruption reforms, progress, challenges, and what are some of the priorities, both short-term and long-term for Ukraine. As you know, this is a very important topic, not only for EU accession, it's also an important topic to attract foreign direct investment into Ukraine and for Ukraine to become a modern economy. And I would say it's also tied to the war effort and to supporting Ukraine right now. Here in the United States, we are witnessing some of this criticism coming from some members in Congress about aid to Ukraine, and the criticism is that Ukraine's we don't know where the money is going to. There's no accountability, and another narrative is that Ukraine is not doing enough in terms of combating corruption and oligarchization. What is the name? Oligarchs. So I just totally butchered that. But yeah, so there's all these different criticisms. So today we're going to unpack some of these issues, and I have a really excellent panel today. And I want to thank, the AV team for accommodating such a big panel and so early today, Monday morning. So I'll briefly introduce everyone, and then I'll give them a chance to talk a little bit about what they're doing, their work on anti-corruption. So we have Hanna Hopko. She's former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Verkhovna Rada. Welcome, Hanna. Alyona Getmanchuk. She's founder and director of the New Europe Center. Olena Halushka. She's board member of the Anti-Corruption Action Center. And then these ladies, thank you. You came from Ukraine. Closer, but still far, I would say Professor Matthew Murray he's an adjunct professor of international and public affairs from Columbia University in New York. And then Max Bergman, you came how many levels down? Max Bergman is director of Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program here at CSIS. So before we jump into these questions that I have for you, can you tell us, maybe I'll go from right to further out. Tell us a little bit, what you do on anti-corruption in 2 minutes, and what brings you here today. So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining this discussion that early. Actually, the name of my organization very much speaks for itself, Anti-Corruption Action Center. We do all things anti-corruption. The center was established in 2011 during the presidency of Yanukovych. So by today, we have a very good understanding and the practical experience of how the dynamics and the tendencies in fight against corruption and the democratization reforms changed in Ukraine. And when the Revolution of Dignity opened the window of opportunities for us to do the reforms, we were engaged in the advocacy and implementation of the anti-corruption reforms related to accountability. And here I mean the establishment from scratch of anti-corruption institutions such as National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, High Anti-Corruption Court, But we were also pushing forward a lot on the transparency, like the electronic asset declaration system, which were recently restored or opening up of all of the registries. What I have to mention, and I want to stress it separately, that Ukraine is fighting corruption not because our international partners or the civil society wants to do that, but our society is very much hardcore, and it keeps demanding the real fight against corruption since 2014 in any and every public opinion poll. So as long as the Ukrainian society doesn't give up about their eventual goal, how Ukraine should look like, I'm pretty optimistic that we will manage to fix those things, but it just may take more time than we would want.
Thank you. Aliona?
Good morning. Thank you for having us today. So I'm running a think tank which is called New Europe Center, and at our think tank based in Kiev we have two strategic priorities. The first priority is Ukraine's future membership in the EU, and the second strategic priority is Ukraine's future membership in NATO. Why it's so important? Because from our point of view, and not only our, but also I know that some European and American decision makers and experts share this opinion that Ukraine actually has only two options. The first option is to be fully integrated into the EU and NATO, into Western structures, and the second option is to be colonized by Russia. So, and I think that neither we in Ukraine nor you are in the US and in Europe are not interested in the second scenario. On anti-corruption, we are involved in the sense that we see anti-corruption is an important part as maybe the most powerful tool, or we see the EU accession process as the most powerful tool for fighting corruption in Ukraine. And we as think tank also launched a coalition which is called Candidate Check Coalition, and this coalition is conducting independent monitoring of implementation of EU-related reforms and the recommendation, including 7 recommendations. So we conducted already our coalition, and both Hanna and Holena's think tanks are the part of this coalition. So we conducted already 5 editions of this independent monitoring. It looks like that on all major EU-related reforms. And we are happy now that European Commission
Last week, yes, we received this great news that European Commission recommended European Council to open accession talks with Ukraine based on Ukraine's progress on the reforms.
Thank you. Professor?
Thank you very much, Romina, and good morning, everybody. It is a great honor to be here with these courageous, vigilant, and resilient leaders from Ukrainian civil society. We're very lucky to be led by them from an international perspective, and I'm incredibly impressed by their commitments. So I've been working, in addition to teaching, I've been working on anti-corruption for over 3 decades now. I've worked as the founder and director of an NGO in this region, in the Eurasia region. I've worked on this issue as a human rights lawyer. I've worked on it as a senior government official in the Obama administration, and I've worked on it as a practitioner in the field, advising governments. And my particular focus has been on prevention, the architecture of preventing corruption, the right mix of institutions, laws, rules, and practices that help a country narrow the space in which the corruption occurs in the first place. And so in that sort of capacity as a practitioner, I was very honored recently that I was nominated by USAID and appointed by the government of Ukraine to help select the new chairperson of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention. And just for everybody's awareness, this process was officially launched on Friday. The position opening has been posted today. And the idea is to help run a very clean, transparent, and accountable process to select the top quality candidates that are qualified to do this very important work in Ukraine. So that's an honor to be able to participate in that.
Thank you. Thank you. Anna?
Thank you so much for organizing this important event. So 10 years ago, when we in Kyiv went to Maidan, actually, personally, I couldn't expect that it will take almost 1/4 of my life to de-imperialize Russian Federation, because from 2013, when we stood up to defend Ukrainian civilizational choice to be part of the EU, we couldn't imagine that after almost 10 years, we will be all defending the free world from anti-Western axis, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, all together. So now this battle for Ukraine placed in the EU moved to the global battle to defend the whole world from authoritarianism and actually totalitarian regime, what is we are seeing in Russian Federation. So for 10 years, of course, I went from activist in Maidan, organizing and representing the civic sector of Euromaidan, then entered to the parliament and chaired for the 5 years of Foreign Affairs Committee. And of course, there are many lessons learned from how we started to build anti-corruption infrastructure in Ukraine, from first legislation and debates, how to establish National Anti-Corruption Bureau, then Agency of Prevention Corruption, then SAPO. So it's I think Ukraine could write a special book advising when we move after Russian defeat, we will help some Central Asia or other countries to share Ukraine experience, how we managed to build from scratch our anti-corruption system. And also, at that time, I didn't expect it that besides cleaning Ukraine from oligarch, from the fifth column, which is still ongoing process, and it's not easy because to overcome the Soviet legacy and then oligarchic system which was established during Kuchma time. So it's, I will not perfectionize saying that everything in Ukraine as we would like to see, so, but we are working very hard, and I think the key is the civil society role and contribution and motivation and also demand of the society. So now if you look at the surveys, so it's almost 100% of the population, they want to see results of corruption, fight with, of corruption. And the historic decision this year, Ukraine opening negotiation for the EU, is just a part of our geopolitical integration to EU and NATO. And I do believe that next year, White House will be more strong and giving Ukraine a political invitation. Unfortunately, this didn't happen this year. Time flies, and it's already 20 countries we visited after the full-scale war. Personally, 20 countries. For some countries, like the United States, it's my 5th visit. So it's unstoppable travel, advocating and mobilizing the world to help Ukraine to win. So this is why I think it's really important that we have to consider reform process and transformation of Ukraine and actual implementation of incorporated into the constitution our strategic foreign policy goal to become NATO and the EU members. And I think Ukraine definitely, we are not just the contributor of European security. I think Ukraine, with our decolonization of Russian experience, could become a strategic country for building these bridges with global South nations and also sharing our experience of transformation, including anti-corruption. So this is my key point. And of course, besides developing an effective infrastructure of anti-corruption law enforcement agencies in Ukraine, we also were forced to fight with strategic corruption, like Nord Stream 2 projects from the beginning. So this is why I think with this 10 years of ongoing Russian aggression, we learned a lot. And it's not just about making Ukraine transparent with strong institutions, rule of law. It's also about global system, because dirty money of authoritarian regimes are also undermining all our efforts to defend democracy. So I think we could contribute both by making Ukraine a successful case from former Soviet Union countries about our tradition, and Ukraine and Moldova joining to the EU and having opening the negotiations also could be shared with Georgia, Belarus after victory, and Azerbaijan, Armenia, and other countries. Thank you.
We'll delve into these issues in a minute, but and then Max.
Great. Well, thank you, Romina. It's a real honor to be on the stage with everyone, especially women from Ukraine that are leading the anti-corruption effort and also Ukraine's pathway towards the European Union. I think the way I come at these issues is mainly looking at it more from the EU lens and the European perspective, or as an American looking at it from a European perspective. And I think what is become very clear to the U.S. government and to all those that want to see Ukraine become an EU member and to see Ukraine rebuilt and have a European future is that EU membership is absolutely essential. And some of this, I think, stems from the U.S. experience and also the European experience in the Western Balkans. We forget the United States fought essentially 2 wars in the Western Balkans, and then over the last 20 years had not played a very central role, had sort of in the EU itself, the accession process for many Western Balkan countries has completely stalled. And there's this great irony that EU enlargement is both the EU's most successful policy, I think, ever, and has given the EU essentially continental scale and geopolitical heft, 450 million people, an economy the size of the United States and China. And yet, the EU completely turned against accession over the last 10 years. And it was actually Ukraine's war that has now brought EU enlargement back on the table. And the reason why is partly for the same reason why we thought that globalization and engagement with Russia and with other countries would lead to them becoming democracies. Well, the EU also thought that just letting countries in would then lead to them becoming wealthy democracies. And in some ways, that has been the case. But there's also been instances where progress has stalled. So countries like Bulgaria, where we're definitely not hitting all the EU targets back in 2007 when it became a member. Yet there was sort of the political understanding that, you know what, it'll get there. And I think what we need to see in the coming years is both lots of progress on the Ukrainian end, but then it also requires an intense willingness on the EU to demonstrate that it is actually willing to enlarge and to make Ukraine a member. And then what is the role of the United States? Well, I think part of what we are trying to do here at CSIS is say that the United States does have a role. We have an intense role in both Ukrainian security, but also in European security. And so when we push Europe not always moves, but we have more influence in Europe than any other region in the world. And how do we use our leverage to both push for the EU to maintain momentum on the accession process, and then also use the influence that we have with Ukraine to then push Ukraine on that path. And we have a positive momentum when it comes to EU accession. And that also means taking tremendous action and real action on corruption, which I think is now a major focal point and something that and is an important focal point, and I think will continue.
Thank you very much for those introductory remarks. And now I want to go into some of these challenging and difficult questions. So, we hear a lot that particularly in the West, that, Ukraine is a massively corrupt country. That's the perception. I wanted to ask you, is that perception correspond to reality on the ground? So I know you mentioned that the whole society wants to change, but the perception abroad is that Ukraine, everybody's corrupt in Ukraine. So how do you react to that?
Well, I might probably start. It is absolutely not true that everybody in Ukraine is corrupt. And I think that on one hand, we do have this kind of paradox, you know, that when the country is getting increasingly transparent, and when all of the public procurements are being published online in the form of the auction, plus you are having all of the income and assets declarations of all of public officials, starting with the president and going down to village councillors online, which they have to report on a yearly basis. Then you have all of the registries open, registries of the vehicle, property, land cadastre, etc. You're having very strong investigative journalists who are not afraid of reporting corruption even during the wartime. And it is complicated, of course, because you have to think, whether this information might not be misused by your enemies. But investigative journalists continue doing their reporting, they continue expose corruption, which transforms into a more comprehensive measures how to eliminate this corruption systematically. Plus, we have anti-corruption bodies, institutions who are also doing a lot of investigations, who are doing arrests, and we are having people like Kolomoisky behind bars. We have the head of the Supreme Court who was caught red-handed taking a bribe. He's also in jail. I mean, how many countries we can name in the world where one of the most important figures within the judiciary is being investigated upon the real evidence-based corruption claims, not because of the political persecution. So Ukraine is changing, and since 2014 we have introduced a lot of the nitty-gritty institutional things which are not very interesting to the general audience, which do not sell newspapers and do not make the headlines, because nobody is interested in building real institutions which sustained the first weeks of the full-scale genocide and didn't, break down and continue operating into 20 months of the full-scale war. So long story short, does Ukraine have the corruption issues? Of course, we still have. But the bottom line is that we understand how to fix them. We know what is our homework. We will build on the previous achievements and on the previous results. And with the help of tools like the EU integration, like the lists of reforms which are coming from the IMF, the US submitted their list, plus with Ukraine's very vocal civil society and very committed investigative journalists, and Ukrainian society's continuous demand to fight against corruption, I'm pretty optimistic. And here I would like to give the last example, which from my perspective is a brilliant example. That's how we were restoring the electronic asset declaration system. It has been closed during the full-scale war because of the security reasons, but at a certain point we realized that we need to bring back all those transparency measures back into Ukrainian public life. And Ukrainian international partners were demanding to restore the system but keep it closed. And Ukrainian parliament adopted this law, which was to the large extent corresponding with the international demands, sent it to the parliament, to the president for the signature, and Ukrainian society, Ukrainian people collected 80,000 votes in the petition to the president to open the registry in just 2 days. President heard the message of the society very clearly, returned it back to the parliament, and it was open. So this, from my perspective, proves that in some cases, Ukrainian society is even much more demanding and much more harsh on the Ukrainian government on the fight against corruption. So it is also very important to realize that this is the underlying desire of Ukrainian society, because that was one of the demands of the Revolution of Dignity, and that is one of the values which we are right now defending on the battlefield.
And it's one of the, sorry to interrupt, one of the main sort of issues that President Zelensky was spearheading when he was
Campaigning, yes,
right?
and that's, that was one of the reasons why he was basically elected. And if Ukrainians wanted, they didn't care, we didn't care about corruption, rule of law, human rights, then why would we be dying in the war against Russia? Because all those things, you know, they are about the Russian occupation. And we are fighting hard for having resilient, corruption-free rule of law and strong democracy, European and NATO integrated.
Perfect. Professor, can I bring you in? Because, you know, there's, what do you say, you know, to this perception? You've studied many countries, you know, you advise many countries, so how does Ukraine compare, let's say, to others?
So I think not only is the perception wrong, but it's dangerous. And it says more about the West in some cases than it does about Ukraine. And let me explain that. So I think this focus on corruption, which is often very narrow, has become self-limiting. It has become a way of saying, this is why we won't do what is required from a point of view of political will, resources, and commitment to help Ukraine win the war and win the peace. And so this perception is also missing something very fundamental, which is, let's remember Russia's systemic corruption, right? Russia's systemic corruption is a very important cause of this war. And it is rooted not just in the way they have tried to conduct a kind of post-imperial foreign policy, it's rooted in their economy. The economy is run by what I call the law, the iron law of oligarchy. And the iron law of oligarchy requires Russia to expand and try to work in other countries, including Ukraine, on the basis of a system of crony capitalism. And so post-Maidan, post-Revolution of Dignity, as Ukraine demonstrated that it was, from the bottom up, committed to joining the European Union, that was the economic equivalent for Russia of Ukraine joining NATO. And so they started fighting Ukraine's, the spirit of the Maidan right away, and by annexing Crimea, by invading the eastern Donbass, they've expanded that, that military invasion as of February 2022, but it's very much rooted in a war over economic systems. And so we in the West need to remember that there's an economic dimension to this. And when we begin to talk about Russia's or Ukraine's corruption, we're feeding a narrative that helps Russia continue to conduct that sort of disinformation war successfully, undermine political will in Ukraine and in the West to build on the institutions that these individuals have helped organize and help create, which are an asset. That's the final point I'll make. We need to think not of corruption as a problem, but we need to think of anti-corruption as an asset in building a better system of economic governance in Ukraine that will help both defeat Russia, but also create what Hanna is described very eloquently, which is a commitment to a better European Union in the future.
So following up on those remarks, should this issue of corruption be the reason why United States stops providing aid to Ukraine?
Not only should it, no, it should not be. And so, again, if you broaden the lens and you look at this war as part of a larger economic conflict in the world between the iron law of oligarchy, as represented by Russia, and to some extent China, Iran, and other countries, and the rule of law, then Ukraine is the central battlefield. This has been called lawfare by different people. So in Ukraine, lawfare has tragically turned into a hot war. And if we in the West and we in the United States are committed to democracy-based capitalism, then we have to remain committed to helping Ukraine with that economic effort. And the idea that we should be, of course we need to condition our aid on proper anti-corruption internal controls. But the first step towards that is for us, practically speaking, to make sure our systems are running well. If you look at evidence from the Balkans and you look at evidence from what what the West has done to contribute to corruption in other parts of the world, we need to be very much more focused on our clean hands. If we do our part, then civil society in Ukraine will take care of the rest.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the ladies wants to
I just fully support the professor's statement, and actually for these 10 years, when I mentioned strategic corruption, which is also like erosion of Western values, and it's a huge problem because for 8 years, more than 8 years, one pro-Russian oligarch, Mr. Firtash, he is sitting in jail, not even in jail, in Vienna, in Austria, in Vienna, with the request from the United States to be extradited to the United States and to be on the justice system. But nothing happened. And I remember my debates in my previous capacity as the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee with some EU officials saying, okay, you are criticizing Ukraine that we are not performing well in anti-corruption, but please demonstrate us successes with extradition of Mr. Firtash to the US. Because I fully support that from old Soviet type economic system, how Siloviki, how Russian oligarchs, how they build this from KGB to FSB system, network abroad with all their network of agents using Russian oil and gas. This is why when we are talking what is the strategy of the West towards Russian Federation, and economy is a key part of this, and especially denuclearization, demilitarization. Also what to do with Russian oil and gas, how not to allow Russia to use money from oil and gas to keep corrupting or bribing Western elites abroad to undermine the whole Western system. So I think this is the key, because it's about survival, democracy abroad. It's not just about Ukraine. And actually what I've seen for many cases, Ukraine, the more we are transparent, like during the war with this 17 hryvnias for X, Olena mentioned already, higher Supreme Court had Kolomoisky now, so the more like it's media write about this, the more perceptions, oh, Ukraine is not is another case that they catch corrupted guy. Another, what we cannot hear from Russia, China, and others. Everything fine there. There is no corruption there. Yeah. There is just a totalitarian, authoritarian system. There is no freedom of speech, freedom of media, because no one is reporting about these cases. So in Ukraine, it's also the price for being democratic society, when it's hard to hide something from society. And I think also we conducted, because we are talking about law enforcement, anti-corruption agencies, but we should also talk about another reforms that we managed to adopt, decentralization reform. It's another important anti-corruption reform. When before I was one of the legislator adopted many legislation. For example, amendment to budget and fiscal code that previously, before the Euromaidan, all money went to Kyiv, and then representatives of cities, they were staying in line in Kyiv, negotiating how to take this money back. So now the taxes are in the local communities. So it's another demonopolization in gas sector. We adopted a law on gas market. Still, it's not easy, but it's a part of energy policy. And I do believe Ukraine will implement this American list, where they have one of the reform priority. It's anti-monopoly committee, because it's key for us to succeed in anti-monopoly, because fighting with oligarchs, de-oligarchization, it's important to avoid re-oligarchization. And actually all this customs service reform, anti-monopoly committee, and procurement in defense ministry, energy. So it's also another way of transparency, accountability, and demonopolization. But what is also very important, you mentioned investment to Ukraine. The trust is needed, but also investment is needed first to return Ukrainians back home. And actually we need middle class. And this is why when we are talking to our Western donors, IMF and others, we are asking for special funds for small and medium-sized enterprises, especially in agriculture sector, startups and others, that all these people, they have access to cheap money, not like 20% of interest rate per year, which is impossible to return. So it's another important now when EU facility provided 50 billion for Ukraine for 4 years, but all the money will go to budgetary support. But we need separate programs to support small and medium enterprises, because they are the one who, after invasion in 2014 and after the full-scale war, they contributed a lot. They donated money,
they employ
and
people,
all their savings. And I traveled a lot recently, Dnipro, Cherkasy, Chernihiv city, Sumy region. So people in local communities, they are saying like, Hannah, where we can find more anti-air defense system, like in Sumy. It's north to, from Kyiv, closer to Russian border, because Russia used this guided missile bombs, which is a huge problem, because the number of these aerial guided missile bombs, which they are using like 50 kilometers from the fighting line, it's horrible. They are destroying all villages. So people demanding their anti-air defense system. But in the more safe places, they ask, we need more investment and access to cheaper money. So we have to, as another measure to fight corruption in Ukraine, to establish middle class, because the poorer society is, the more populists will, during next elections, promise everything. Tariffs, no tariffs for gas, nothing. Okay. So we remember this experience.
Thank you. I want to jump to, because we can talk here for hours, but I want to jump to another question. And there's also this argument that the foreign aid that we're providing Ukraine is not being accounted, so that, you know, our military aid, our humanitarian aid, is going like to a black box, right? So how do you react to that assertion? Maybe I can start with Max or with Professor.
Could I, because this, again, this is a popular perception. It's being generated in part because unusual to these circumstances is the fact that Ukraine is openly fighting with corruption. When you openly fight with corruption and you're successful, then you're exposing corruption. And so people cumulatively look at that and they say, oh, there's corruption. But not what really they should be looking at is the success in exposing it. And so the same applies for the great U.S. effort to supply Ukraine to date with both military, economic, and humanitarian aid. We have inspector generals from each of defense, from USAID, from state, from other agencies, working together to make sure that they monitor, investigate, and learn lessons from any aid that may not make it to where it's targeted. They've been working very rigorously on this, And they've also done something new, which is that they've joined forces. They've decided they're going to work together as inspector generals to share information, share know-how, and then apply those lessons learned to future aid efforts. And so again, this idea that it's not either getting to where it's supposed to get, or it's generally speaking going into a black hole, there's no real evidence to support that. On the contrary, there's at least a dozen reports out there that the IGs have already completed saying, we're doing pretty well, folks, and what we need is support for the public servants who are doing this hard work.
Yes,
Can
Max.
I think it's also important to sort of separate both economic and military assistance.
Yep.
The military assistance, let's be clear, that money does not actually go to Ukraine. That money goes to U.S. defense companies or just the Pentagon directly. Almost none of the security assistance funds actually go to Ukraine. They just go to buy weapons, and the weapons themselves go to Ukraine. And then when concerns of potential leakage of weapons, well, in past cases of the United States support to countries such as in Iraq and other places, well, there were opportunities for weapons to leak out, but that was often due to the fact that there were other conflicts, there were other buyers and incentives. In Ukraine, there is a major focus on a front line, and if any weapons leaked out, well, they would just simply go back to the Ukrainian forces because the Ukrainians are so desperate for weaponry. So the demand is in Ukraine, so there's no real threat of that kind of commercial leakage that you've seen in perhaps other places. And so I think that's, when I think of weapons leakage, I think there's, Ukraine is sort of not the country that I would ever worry about there. And then when it comes to the economic assistance, I think it's really important to understand that the economic assistance also provides, there comes with strings. It comes with accounting. It, in one sense, is an anti-corruption tool in and of itself. And when you think of, when I have looked at EU cohesion funds and efforts by the EU to provide aid to countries that are looking to become EU members, what has been critical, and this is before those countries have become members, there's become real issues after they've become members, such as with Hungary, but before a country becomes members, that money is oftentimes used to modernize companies or accounting infrastructures or governments. And the EU is paying incredibly close attention to where that money is being spent. Now, the issue with the EU has often been when the prospect of membership is not there, or sort of is clearly, far in the distance, and then the political will to then enact the tough reforms that are needed. And I think one thing about corruption that is important to kind of contextualize is that corruption is about power. So if elites are adopting anti-corruption measures, well, they're fundamentally disentangling instruments of power that were used by, that are embedded in society. And so there has to be political incentives to do so. And so maintaining that political momentum, then with the incentives such as providing funding to streamline transitions, I think is incredibly important. And without that aid and assistance, the anti-corruption process becomes a lot slower. And in Ukraine's case, a lot of our assistance is simply going to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, which is also critical to the war effort. And if that money gets pulled, then you're looking at a very terrible situation in Ukraine in which you are creating situations for corruption to actually become more rife.
But we also hear here in the United States, why should we continue supporting, give economic support to Ukraine when we have problems here at home, and putting aside, that this is, money that's not accounted for. We don't hear a lot, what you were saying about, Russian assets. So we have these frozen assets, the central bank assets from Russia frozen in Europe, in the United States. But we don't hear, a lot of talk about how to maybe use that money towards the war effort, or how to to your point, have a real discussion on how the West should also be tackling this issue of, Russian assets in Europe, and how a little bit we've supported, this oligarchization. So, can you talk a little bit about this issue? How the donors and the United States can be supporting the Ukraine's effort, and how we can maybe use these assets in the future for the war effort and for the reconstruction. So I don't know if anybody wants to.
Yeah, maybe I start and my colleague will add. Olena is a key expert on confiscation of assets. But I think the key is here also to pay attention to the second analysis published by General Zaluzhny. Because a year ago in December, when he made a call asking for 300 tanks that we need for spring offensive. So unfortunately, not receiving enough weapon. This incrementalism or this incremental approach is killing, let's be frank. With sanctions, we are thankful for sanctions, but they are not a hellish one to kill Russian economy, that they are not able to produce more munition, more kamikaze drones, more missile and ballistic rockets and others. This is cruise missile, and so this is really a serious question for us, because we in Ukraine, someone consider this second article as about positional war, as that Ukraine is losing or the situation is worsening in others. No, this was a wake-up call that Ukraine needs to get faster at bigger scale, because look what's happened. North Korea provided Russia with more munition than the whole West together. This is unacceptable, honestly. The strategic value of Ukraine is our people. We want our people, the best engineers, IT specialists, to serve for the future democracy, working in the EU, in NATO, not being killed by Russians because we are lack of weapon. So now we are upgrading our victory strategy, but there is 4 major directions where we need Western support, and it's in common interest, because when we are talking about weapons, I fully support what you just said, that actually when we are hearing about unprecedented level of support, we are thankful for support, but it's not unprecedented, because if it's unprecedented level, we would be in Crimea a year ago. And actually the war genocidal character and genocide would never happen. So we could avoid this scenario of full-scale war before implementing these hellish sanctions 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. I do remember all this because I traveled to many capitals convincing our Western partners, please stop Nord Stream 2. Because this is not about economy, this is weaponization of gas, this is corruption of Western elites. So no one wanted to hear, everyone was telling like Hannah, no, it's pure economic project. So now when we are saying this message, sacrificing Ukraine or just observing how we are, I came from Bucharest, from Security Forum, and a day when I was, everyone was applauding to the Ukrainian special forces for destroying 2 Russian ships. 2 Russian ships, it happened on Sunday. Everyone's like, wow, Ukrainian armed forces are great. They are so creative. They destroyed Moscow. They destroyed Russian military navy in Sevastopol and others. Why we are so creative? Because we have lack of ATACMS, lack of Taurus, lack of system. But the question is, I visited India at the end of August, and actually everyone was like telling, we learned a lot from Western support to Ukraine within these 10 years. So this is also a credibility of the West is at stake, because this authoritarian mafia club, they don't care about human lives, like in Russia. They will send more and more troops, which will be, but in our case, we value every soldier. So this is why the faster we receive, and we are here also to express gratitude to American people, because without your support, we couldn't to support our armed forces, to secure our payments to the budget, everything. But my message is, it's not enough to win. And the question is, Are you helping us to win or not to collapse or to keep the front line at the same level? Because in war of attrition, this is what Russia is interested in. Ukraine cannot compete with Russia. Russia has much more resources, different type of resources, from financial, military, manpower, and Russia is equipped by North Korea, China, Iran, and they don't hesitate with supply. And I'm sure when Russia will be running out of resources in 1-2 years of time because of, so China will immediately step up and supply, because it's what China is doing now. China is building a new architecture of alliances, BRICS, SHOS, or how it's in English, Shanghai Organization of Partnership, and then investment in Latin America, Nicaragua, Honduras, and others, Africa, from economic expansion to military base like in Djibouti and others. So China is preparing and building this infrastructure globally, observing and learning. And we will see what happened with the presidential election in Taiwan, also in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is why I think defeat of Russia in Ukraine, it's a deterrent strategy and real demonstration of US leadership. Then people in India will never be laughing like I went through this experience, that we've seen already how the West supported Ukraine from 2014, from peaceful settlement to a real genocide what's happening now. So this is why I think we need to wake up all together and supply as soon as possible everything needed, and to respond on Zaluzhny call with more ATACMS, more Taurus, and transatlantic community, the US, European partners should do proactively more, not just talk about fatigue, because, and why all these questions, why European taxpayers should pay to help Ukraine, why American taxpayers. So I think it's really important. There is confiscation of Russian assets. Let's confiscate, finally.
So let me ask you, you mentioned, there's polling here that, shows some decline of support to Ukraine. What happens if the United States stops supporting Ukraine?
On polls, maybe. Oh, you
Well,
want to
it's
answer?
not only polls.
Because,
There's also presidential candidates that do not support.
We've seen already
There's
statements from
Congress.
the EU.
So,
I think
one route is the Russian aspect. What would be the scenario?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why there is this a kind of decline in supporting, because there is no clear vision of the strategy how Ukraine could actually win the war. So as long as it takes, unfortunately, this strategy failed. Let's be honest. And we are already, Hannah mentioned war of attrition. Unfortunately, we are already in the war of attrition. And in this war of attrition, of course, it's extremely important to send a signal to Putin that it's not necessarily he and Russia who would win in the war of attrition. And you could send this signal like just doing a couple of things. One of the things that Ukraine would get, could secure financial support. Another thing is that Ukraine could be provided by long-term security instrument, because it's not like if we are talking about reforms process in Ukraine or EU accession process of Ukraine, neither of those processes would not be successful and would not be sustainable without proper security conditions, without proper security options. And that's why for us it's NATO membership, future NATO membership is even more important than EU membership. And actually that was an opinion poll recently in Ukraine when majority of Ukrainians said that NATO membership is more important than EU membership, precisely because of that. If you don't have security foundation, to conduct reforms, to enter the EU, to do reconstruction and the recovery process, to get back Ukrainians, millions of Ukrainians who are now in Europe, you cannot discuss seriously about future of Ukraine as a modern European state. So my first point, there should be clear strategy of Ukraine's winning the war. As long as it takes, it's no more the option. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know. And your second question was?
No, I was saying how do we tie Russian assets to, you know?
Oh, that's Olena's topic. And sorry, your second question also was what would happen if U.S. stop providing support. So we are already thinking about this scenario, even so I cannot imagine how American people who understand that Ukraine is fighting for freedom, who value freedom, you know, who understand the consequences of, throwing Ukraine under the bus, would agree with the idea that U.S. would stop the support, or maybe minimize,
not stop, but decline, because there's a perception that Europe should be picking up the slack.
First of all, I'm a little bit surprised that there is still a discussion in the US that the US is doing everything and Europe is doing like very little. In fact, when we look at the data, credible sources, you see that the US has provided like around $67 billion of economic and military aid of Ukraine, while Europe already provided $96 billion. So Europe has already outnumbered the US in providing support for Ukraine if you collect all kinds of type of support, like military, economic, humanitarian, security. The second issue that, of course, now we are working hard in order to mobilize European partners, European member states, who finally see Ukraine as a future member of the EU. Even last year, when we were granted candidate status, it was not like the point for some of the most skeptical states, so they were not sure that, Ukraine would become EU member state. Now there is this shift. They see Ukraine as a future member of the EU, and they're thinking seriously how to contribute in this accession process. And we, three of us, actually, of our delegation, we came to Washington from Paris, and we heard like very encouraging signals from French decision makers, politicians, experts, and I could even quote here one of French government official who said that we will always find money for Ukraine. So that was really encouraging. But of course, given the scale of aggression, given the scale of destruction in Ukraine, it would not be enough. So we will need US money. And we are pretty much convinced that US aid to Ukraine is very good investment. And this investment is already working properly,
I would briefly add here some figures that over the first year of the full-scale war, Russian destruction caused the decline of Ukraine's GDP by 29%, meaning that in just 1 year, Russia destroyed almost 1/3 of Ukrainian economy. And in hard numbers, that first year brought us the losses of $411 billion. And last year, Russia damaged significantly our energy infrastructure, and we are ahead of the winter, and the next winter would be very hard too, because despite the fact that we have received more air defense, but Russians adapt their fighting tactics very fast. and they know how to target our facilities if they want to exhaust our air defense system. And Russians are waging the wars in the so-called scorched earth tactics, meaning that we cannot even assess what are the losses on the occupied territories, but they are enormous. So for us, it's about livability of our country. And economic assistance is incredibly important because it's about running our economy, it's about country being the place where residents can still live. It's about, the attempts to basically, arrange the grain deal ourselves. And just today, there was the announcement that the 100th ship left Odessa within this, Ukrainian corridor. Not Russian grain deal, but that corridor that we imposed ourselves, but by basically protecting by the military means the routes on the Black Sea, but all those things, including the demining, including the giving the farmers possibility to plant the necessary, seeds, crops, yes, there, and export this food to the world. All those things, they obviously need money. They obviously need investment. So we campaign right now to make Russia pay. And this is one of the reasons why, one of the focuses why we went to Paris and why we are here in DC, because in between supporting Ukraine with Western taxpayers' money and stop supporting Ukraine, there is also this make Russia pay, because the West sits on 300 billion of Russian central bank money. And if, with regards to the Russian oligarchs' money, there still might be the issues, private property, the need to prove the link between particular oligarch and the aggression. With the Russian central bank's money, it's absolutely clear. There is this myth that the money is protected from the confiscation by the sovereign immunity, but the sovereign immunity actually regards only judicial confiscation. And this confiscation would be done via the decision of the executive bodies, executive authorities. So what we are right now campaigning for is establishing the G7 coalition with all of the partners doing their job on the confiscating this money and channeling them for the support of Ukraine's self-defense, but also, of course, recovery and the compensation of the losses which Russian aggression has inflicted.
So
Romina, may I?
Yeah.
Because for one thing, I have to.
You have to
just
catch
a couple
up.
minutes.
Yeah.
So I just want to see if I can tie together some of these themes. You're asking very big questions that are at the heart of the debate on Capitol Hill today about the future funding of Ukraine. And the pressures on limiting or stopping funding are real. So we have to acknowledge that. In order to counter that building political narrative, if you will, it's very important that Western leaders, American members of Congress continue to focus on this as a war between the iron law of oligarchy and the rule of law, between globalized corruption and running the world economy based on rules. Because there's more at stake in Ukraine than territory and lives, actually. The sovereignty of a country and its ability to build an economy based on the rule of law, based on an entrepreneurial model, which Ukraine has come to exemplify in every sphere. They are becoming a startup nation, right? And so what we need to be, we need to pull back the camera a bit and focus on the economic stakes, as well as the political, geopolitical, and territorial stakes. And to do that, this confiscation question has been well addressed now, not only by the work of Elena and her team, but also by Harvard Law School, by a team of people that got together and wrote a great piece for Foreign Affairs. And basically what they've said is they've addressed the international law prohibitions on this kind of confiscation by saying, well, international law has to evolve.
Yeah.
International law has to come up with a new theory, and the theory they've come up with is this kind of reciprocity to address a situation where basically Russia is conducting itself in a way so as to upset the entire international law system. So under those circumstances, there are international law mechanisms and arguments for taking reciprocal action and confiscating these assets and turning them into support for human capital in Ukraine.
So before you go, I have a follow-up question on, we heard that from the ladies that there's been a lot of progress on anti-corruption reform, but there's also this concern that after victory, things will go back to, business as usual, or there's going to be, oligarchs are going to come back, and so there's also that concern that we're making all these investments and, things will go back. So as as an expert on preventing re-oligarchization or new oligarchs from coming again to power, what should we do about that? What is your response?
And so we should level set. We should recognize that the risk of new corruption is real. And the risk of new corruption will come both from external forces and internal forces who will be inclined to form new networks around large disbursements of resources that are attached to different programs and ministries within Ukraine. So we should acknowledge that. A key strategy for reducing that risk and otherwise turning anti-corruption into an asset is to remember that as you dismantle oligarchic networks, you have to create entrepreneurial networks. You have to replace them with new economies. And there's an ample evidence and ample material to work with. There's huge human capital to work with in Ukraine to make sure that we're building this entrepreneurial model of capitalism, which is really what the Revolution of Dignity was all about. And so we just have to keep our focus on supplying those entrepreneurs. Case in point is what the great work of the Ministry of Digital Transformation to digitize not only governance, but also to use digital tools to grow the economy of Ukraine under this digital for freedom policy.
Yep, Max, and
Yeah, I think just one point on the seizing of Russian assets. I think there's a lot of banks and others in the international financial system that are quite concerned about the precedent that it would set. But I actually think that's exactly why this should be done, because part of what you want to do is set a precedent that if you take, if you invade another sovereign country, then precedent sort of goes out the window, and that lots of bad things will happen to you as a country. And so I think setting that precedent is actually really important, that seizing Russian sovereign assets and the freezing of Russian sovereign assets that was done and sort of surprised everyone when it happened, when Russia invaded, set, I think, a very useful precedent. And I think the other thing that we have to realize is that what would happen if a lot of this money then was freed up and went to Ukraine? Where would it be spent on? Well, a lot of it would be spent on Ukraine's reconstruction, but a lot of it would be spent actually on Western weapons companies, on Western defense companies, because Ukraine would simply go back to the market and say, well, the Europeans haven't really ramped up their defense industry to the level that is needed, and neither have the United States, but we're going to go in and try to buy the tanks that we need, the other systems that we need, so that Ukraine will have an armed force that would be ready to take on Russia, not just for the next year, but for in 2030 and 2035. So what we're, I think, missing here is that it would set, I think, a really useful precedent, and then also that funding would, I think, be very stimulative to lots of our economies, frankly.
Thank you, Max. Yes.
Yeah. Just to add what Professor said on how to, prevent
the future.
backsliding, in anti-corruption. Actually, one of the answers here is the real EU accession process. You know, because EU is very serious on so-called fundamentals, which include anti-corruption, and without, you know, doing a progress on fundamentals, on anti-corruption, on rule of law installment, Ukraine simply would not be able to move further. But you know, EU membership has become already as a sort of national idea for Ukrainians, with support of 92–93% of people. There is a clear demand for this process, but without any progress on fundamentals, there would be not any progress on that as well. So, and now that's why we are welcome. We are welcome all of those additional, you know, preconditions, additional recommendations on reforms on anti-corruption. We are not happy with some like order European Commission recommendation, which was about law of lobbyism, for example. So we could elaborate more if you're interested in that. But we are welcome actually all of their additional recommendations, and Ukrainian society, you know, welcome them on anti-corruption. So there would be more and more recommendation. And what is EU accession process per se? EU accession process is a constant effort, you know, to demonstrate on permanent basis, not just like one-time exercise, implementing 7 recommendations and that's all. You know, corruption is overcome, the rule of law is installed. No, it's a constant effort, you know, to demonstrate that Ukraine actually is fighting corruption, is installing rule of law, and has a functional market economy. So that's why it's really important for us.
So let me, before I open up for Q&A from the public, let me ask you just one final question. I know there's been a lot of progress on anti-corruption and you're fighting a war at the same time. What would be a priority for the next year on the anti-corruption front? So what would be one thing that you recommend President Zelensky to tackle in the next year? So I'll start with the ladies, and I don't know if Max, you want to answer that.
I actually have 3 things.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, yes, but I'll try to keep them super brief.
So 3 things.
The first one is progress within the judicial reform, and here we already have some processes going on, like the new judicial governance bodies which were established a few months ago would right now start first filling the vacancies, and we have 2,000 vacancies in the courts right now. That's a lot. These are only for judges. And they would also vet 2,000 judges that are already in the system who will pass the qualification assessment. Cleansing of the Supreme Court, where the head was caught red-handed taking bribe, meaning that all of the judges should be scrutinized, and establishment of the High Administrative Court. This is the court which will replace the scandalous OASK, or Kyiv District Court, which was headed by the Judge Vovk. The second is Ministry of Defense. They already started the non-lethal procurements reforms. It is underway. We are cautiously optimistic. It's also important to make sure that people that are in charge of lethal assistance procurements are also of super high integrity and can streamline the processes. And the third thing, by the way, also touched briefly how to make sure that new oligarchs are not appearing on the Reconstruction, because that will be the most let's say, lucrative piece of economy. From our perspective, we have to apply this full transparency approach, and particularly to make sure that all of the cost estimates for all of the construction projects are published online. And when the local authorities, national authorities know that, you know, their contracts will be scrutinized by civil society and investigative journalists, this will be a very powerful safeguard against, adding additional 20% margin somewhere, sneaking it on the last page of the contract.
Aliona?
Actually, Olena is the right person to say about
Okay.
anti-corruption priorities. I just can only add that also it's important to follow these additional recommendations which European Commission provided together with the report, and there is a clear deadline for doing that, is March next year. So, and we as civil society, as expert community, will be actively involved in another independent monitoring efforts on that. So we will do our best in order to have them implemented.
And actually, I now sitting and thinking that we are 1 month ahead of Washington DC summit. Everyone is, and we are in wear a t-shirt, Ukraine in NATO now, and organizing street events in all 31, or maybe at that time 32 NATO members, asking about that Ukraine should become 33rd member of the alliance. So I think that President Zelensky, Ukrainian government and parliament, both ruling party and opposition, together with expert community, we have to deliver progress on the American list that no one in here in White House will say and use an excuse. Oh, political invitation is not because still Ukraine hasn't delivered reforms on judiciary or anti-corruption or decentralization or anti-monopoly and others. So I think this is a homework to do everything possible that no one could use, how to say, lack of some reform, because this list could be endless. What we also afraid. So we could implement this American list with 3 pages of important reforms, to do it like we did before the candidate status submitted the questionnaire all together. It was like the whole society, think tanks involved, helping government to submit to the EU Commission. So this is, I think, really important. Then we will understand that really there are other reasons if we will not be receiving formal invitations. So the reasons not Ukraine. The reasons may be that someone is trading off with Russia on political invitation or something like this. So this is the questions to guarantee that no excuses in our partners and no usage of a lack of progress on reforms to send Ukrainians, wait another year, maybe at next summit in 2025, like from Bucharest 2008 till now. So I think lessons should be learned from our side and from Western.
But Hannah, what would you prioritize in the next year? Like maybe 2 things, as a
Look,
civil society.
My message is, if we prioritize, this will not be enough for our Western partners. They could easily say us, okay, your priorities on judiciary, great, but we send you American list. There are 8 areas. You didn't, you delivered on judiciary. You delivered on 300 detectives hired for NABU, but you have still problem with anti-monopoly committee or with the head of Economic Bureau of Investigation. So my message is, we don't want Western countries, our partners, to instrumentalize reform process to use it as an excuse not to provide us as a pretext. So this is message. Because look, for 10 years, I learned a lot how it's our partners instrumentalize corruption, blaming Ukraine and saying, forget about visa-free regime with the EU, because still you are not perfectly delivered this part of reform. So this is to avoid these scenarios, because otherwise people also will be disappointed if we, as a whole nation, will work to implement all reforms, but then at DC summit, we will hear some unacceptable arguments. So this would be a big disappointment. This is the credibility of North Atlantic Alliance and other institutions. So this is my message.
Max, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think maybe just, I agree with the panel. I do think that when it comes to corruption, sometimes we think of it as sort of a specific act. But I think one of the things that has come out is it's also critically important to have a free and open press, to have a vibrant civil society. And that's why, when we think about this from an EU's perspective, that the rollback of the rule of law essentially enables corruption. So that is why the EU's had to figure out how it's going to take a stronger hand vis-a-vis certain countries within the EU. So to me, what is critical, another critical aspect of fighting corruption is simply the vibrancy of Ukrainian democracy. And that is another, I think, aspect of what the EU and the United States should insist upon. And what I would say is the thing about the difference between NATO and EU membership is NATO membership really does not require jumping through a lot of hoops. I mean, I think the issue with NATO membership that is seen in the United States is that right now the danger for us is that would be seen as it would mean war with Russia because Ukraine is being occupied and Article 5 would definitely apply. And we sort of, the essential credibility of NATO is the United States' willingness to go to war on your behalf. And that, I think, is the fundamental obstacle. But when it comes to the EU, it is not like joining a club. And I think this is very critical, and many Americans don't quite understand this. It is a bit like if Mexico was going to join the United States. Now, what would that mean? That would mean changing the entire legal system. It would mean adopting different standards in all sorts of areas. And so what I think the problem with the EU, or the challenge with the EU accession process, it is both a very technical, teeth-pulling exercise that requires very difficult reforms, but it's also a political exercise. It's a political exercise in the EU's willingness to let that country in, and it's a political exercise internally to do all these reforms. I think the advantage that Ukraine has right now is that when you have a wartime situation, you can do big things very quickly. Things that would seem impossible, oh my God, that's going to take forever, suddenly just happen because you have unity of the public behind you. And so I think we do have a moment for Ukraine to really accelerate that EU process that then deals with anti-corruption, that deals with, that helps modernize the Ukrainian economy. So I think there isn't, I agree with all the things, so I don't have one particular thing, but I think it's maintaining the vibrancy of democracy is then critical for Ukraine, not just to fight and win this war, but also to have a secure future that has an economy that we don't think of as corrupt.
But may I just a small comment, because your argument that US will be in the war with Russia if you provide us political invitation. This is what we were trying to explain before and during the Vilnius summit. Political invitation, it's a signal of commitment. It doesn't mean membership tomorrow. Look at Finland. It took a year for them from a political invitation to membership. With Sweden still fighting to finish all the procedures to become a NATO member. So this is why I think it's really important. We are not asking at NATO DC summit a membership. We are asking to start a long process and having some, how to be correct, naming, okay, some countries in NATO which sometimes behave like a Russian proxy or Trojan horses. So, of course, they could suspend our membership forever. But we need this political commitment that Ukraine is not considered anymore as a buffer zone, as the countries in between and others. So this is what really means for us. And for Russia, it doesn't mean that the US will be in war, because you are saying it's just a first step out of all algorithm of roadmap, which included ratification of bilateral agreements of all national parliaments. It's 31, maybe at that time 32 countries. So it's a long process, but this is why it's important to have this commitment, political invitation. When membership we succeed, it's God probably the only who knows.
Sorry, but our time is almost up, but I don't know if there's any questions from the public here. I have 2 questions from the online audience, but anybody here? No? Oh, and then yeah.
Well, this may come across as a little bit of an odd question in light of the conversation, but I ran across someone who was doing some work in the early Reconstruction work even last year in the energy infrastructure, and his challenge with his company, and this will be a common challenge to U.S. companies, was it involved, I think, some sort of construction on land that was associated with an oligarch. And the mortal fear of any company here is doing anything that is corrupt or even has the appearance of corruption. So obviously I applaud all the anti-corruption work, but looking optimistically a year down, 2 years down, when Reconstruction is happening, hopefully hundreds of billions of dollars is coming in investment, you want to have rigorous controls for corruption from the national down to the local level, and yet that can also be a point of paralysis too. So how do you keep the balance between anti-corruption in a way that doesn't paralyze procurement systems or investment from going forward as all would want?
And thank you for that question, because there's a question from Japan that says the following, that if there was a reconstruction fund set up for Ukraine, what would be the, by the IMF and World Bank, what type of conditionality would that imply? And in terms of anti-corruption, what should we expect, and what would be the asks of Ukraine in this regard for reconstruction? So I don't know if
Well, okay, I'll try to answer. Keeping the balance is always kind of the thing, because, when we were first thinking about what can possibly be the tools and instruments to administer the donors' money, we realized that one of the instruments might be such an international fund, let's say on the World Bank basis or whatever, but the procedures should definitely be streamlined, because if we apply their peacetime procedures to the, maybe not wartime, but I mean the pace of the recovery and reconstruction after the victory would need to be so fast that we catch up, and do not have this reconstruction for centuries. So it's incredibly important, and it has to be very carefully crafted, because, on one hand, definitely, the anti-corruption should not stop the reconstruction, but on the other hand, the speed of reconstruction should not be used in order to keep the corruption loopholes. So, I mean, yes, we all have to keep all those things in mind, but I think that our 10 years of anti-corruption experience already gave us practical knowledge of how to try and balance that. If we speak about safeguards, we think that indeed having the donors administering their money would be one of the good safeguards, especially if they manage to arrange procurements with our tools like Prozorro, just because the procurements, to be honest, is probably the most vulnerable part, because that's the way where the list of demands and indicators might be written the way that it applies only to specific companies. So making sure that we have the free procurement when open competition and everybody can apply, that's one of the things to ensure that the project itself would be successful. But then applying Prozorro. Colleagues developed another system which helps to monitor different phases of the project called DREAM. It's also helpful, but it's part of this ecosystem. Excuse me. Our stance is that if we have managed to achieve this open cost estimates for all of the construction projects, it will be a very important, not even the brick, but maybe the foundation for the transparency of those projects. Plus, we need to make sure that local communities have the ownership over some projects, and that the local civil society and local investigative journalists can watchdog this project, and that they have capacity to watchdog projects, and that the local communities have the capacities to implement projects. So basically, there are many different safeguards, and there will be a very big capacity challenge because Hanna rightly said that we've done decentralization, which from my perspective was one of the most successful anti-corruption reforms without, having the direct link to anti-corruption institutions, but something like cross-cutting anti-corruption reform. But we faced big challenges that the local communities, when the local communities in one of the regions of Khmelnytsk Oblast are writing email to their French colleagues in Ukrainian, so that kind of might complicate the communications, to put it mildly. So we would need to invest, and here we would need a lot of the European support, of the capacity building, teaching, showing, helping them to work with investors, with donors, to write project proposals, to implement, then to report. So there's going to be a lot of difficulties, but in the end, I'm sure that would contribute to having resilient society on all of the different layers, not only on the national level, but most importantly, top down.
Thank you. Anything else? Sorry, we're out of time, but I want to thank everybody for coming and those for watching us online. And of course, thank you for our distinguished panelists. And please come back to CSIS for more discussions.
Thank you for the
Thank you very much for having me.